Okay, well, good afternoon. Welcome to the Bioneering Panel. This obviously is the hardcore, so I appreciate everybody staying late enough to participate in our panel. I'd like to start by introducing myself, make a few general comments, briefly define the concept of bioneering, and then address the session schedule, and then introduce the remaining members of the panel. My name is Jim Logan. I'm a physician, evolutionary biologist, flight surgeon, founding board member of the American Telemedicine Association, a former logistics officer for a tactical airlift group, as well as an external consultant for the RAND Corporation and the Department of Defense. I'm board certified in aerospace medicine. I spent a 22-year career at NASA Johnson Space Center, much of it in direct mission support, sequentially as chief of flight medicine, chief of medical operations, and eventually chief of medical informatics and healthcare systems. I served as the only life science representative to the original space station Skunk Works back in 1982. Shows you how old I am. And also I worked as the chief liaison officer between NASA Life Sciences and the Space Station Project Office at NASA headquarters. After retiring from NASA in 2012, I completed a medical fellowship in undersea and hyperbaric medicine at Duke University, and currently I'm co-founder and CEO of the Space Enterprise Institute, which is a very simple 501c3 educational foundation based, of course, in Texas. Dr. Gerard O'Neill had a profound impact on my life, and it's not an exaggeration to say that his ideas changed the entire trajectory of my professional career. So for me, this is a kind of a pay it forward exercise. Dr. O'Neill may very well have been a visionary, but looking back from the perspective of 58 years of cumulative human spaceflight, he was not clairvoyant, nor should we have expected him to be. There are a lot of things that O'Neill got right and some major things he got wrong. It really is time for a much needed reboot, or a mid-course correction, if you will, of the O'Neill vision of space settlement, which means men, women, children, babies, multiple generations. That is fundamentally different from a mission or an outpost. And we ought to do this based on the evidence in the last 42 years of human spaceflight since the publication of The High Frontier, and especially the last 27 years since his untimely death from leukemia in 1992 at age 65. Now, I had to lobby Edward pretty heavily, as I'm sure he will admit, to change the name of this panel from the standard term human factors, a term I do not like, never have liked, which always sounds like an add-on topic after everything else has been defined, to bioneering with a B, which is or should be a primary driver for everything from destination selection to spacecraft and habitat design, concept of operations. Bioneering is the art and science of sustaining biology, psychology, and physiology, including successful reproduction in novel and frequently hostile environments, with the goal of achieving stable population growth, with increasing levels of cultural complexity, communal security, and robust economic activity. Human families, groups, and tribes have been practicing bioneering since the dawn of our species. Otherwise, they didn't survive. We're fortunate this afternoon to have an outstanding panel. Each panelist, myself included, will make about a 15-minute opening statement. This will be followed by a general 30-minute or so question and answer session. So please hold your questions until then. And then toward the end, each panelist will have the opportunity to make a short closing statement, should they so choose. I'll now introduce the other three members in the order in which they will present. I've had the pleasure of knowing Dr. John Charles. John, please raise your hand. For the past 35 years. John, I can't believe we've gotten that old. But one look at each of us, at both of us, and it's not hard to believe, I think. John retired from NASA JSC in February 2018 after a stellar 33-year career as a civil service space life scientist and science manager. As part of the JSC cardiovascular research team, he developed the operational fluid loading pre-entry interface countermeasure that NASA now uses on all space flights. Moving into science management, John oversaw all NASA science, not just the life science, but all of it. On astronaut missions to the Russian space station Mir, John Glenn's return to space on STS-95, and on Columbia's last mission on STS-107. He represented space life sciences early in the NASA Mars mission planning process and served as chief scientist at NASA's Human Research Program for 6 years, as well as the chief scientist for Scott Kelly's year-long ISS mission, thus helping to lead the NASA twin study of Scott and Mark Kelly. He is now an external consultant and the scientist in residence at Space Center Houston, the official visitor center for Johnson Space Center, lending his unique experience to guest, student, and educator outreach. Morgan Irons, she's the one with the red hair, is the founder and the chief science officer of Deep Space Ecology, a space and agricultural company that works to solve challenges of food security and human sustainability in the deep spaces of Earth, Moon, and Mars and beyond. She's a 2017 Brooke Owens Fellow and a PhD student in the field of soil and crop sciences at the Lehman Lab at Cornell University. Her work has been in research and development of quasi-closed agroecological systems for extreme environments, with more recent research focused on understanding how degraded soils may be revitalized through sustainable soil management practices for agricultural and ecological system use. Joe Carroll, right here. Joe, you have impressed me for years with your creative designs for, among other things, variable gravity research facilities in Leo. In college, he majored in philosophy, but fortunately he saw the light and has been working on space tethers since 1981. He has had 4 successful tether tests. That's an amazing statement. SEDS 1 and SEDS 2, PMG, which is plasma motor generator, and TIPS, tethers in space physics satellite. He also came up with a CubeSat design for the TEPSI, Tether Electrodynamics Propulsion CubeSat experiments, whose 1 kilometer tether may be deployed by the Naval Research Laboratory this month. It's already up in space, but it may be deployed later this month. Joe has made significant contributions to our thinking about not only the design and implementation of artificial gravity in spacecraft and habitats, but also their potential side effects. So you can see it's a very impressive panel. So with that, I'd like to bring John Charles up and let him begin.
What a pleasure, what an honor to be part of this panel and part of this conference. Thank you very much to the organizers for allowing me to be part of this today. I want to give you just a little bit of a perspective, a little bit of framing about the life sciences aspects of space settlement based on our experience, and by that I mean my experience in planning and thinking about space exploration. That is closed finite missions to other planets, like exploration of Mars, considering that let's say the baseline mission to Mars, although it's not been authorized and approved and funded, it will probably be something like 2.5 years with a 6-month trip to Mars, 18 months in residence on Mars, and 6 months back. That's the design reference mission. That's the baseline, the straw man used for planning. The charts I'm going to present will be discussing the risks of that kind of mission, which can be considered the skeleton of a discussion of the risks for space settlement. This is a finite, closed-ended mission, but it can inform our speculations about the risks for going beyond that and staying somewhere else in space for much longer. I'm going to describe to you the crew hazards of deep space missions, and these are the hazards that accrue during the mission. But please do not be misinformed. The most hazardous part of any space mission is the launch. And we heard a lot of discussion in the prior session and elsewhere during this conference about transportation and so forth. Anytime you're fooling with the forces of Mother Nature, anytime you're converting chemical energy stored in the rocket into potential energy and kinetic energy, such that you end up going from 0 to Mach 25 in the space of less than 10 minutes. That is an extremely risky dynamic phase of flight, and most of the risks of spaceflight are during the dynamic phases of flight. You have the launch, and then you have the period of time at the end of the mission when you're converting all of that kinetic and potential energy into thermal energy so you can dissipate it safely, so you can land back where you started, more or less, hopefully at something approaching 0 altitude and 0 velocity, and you'd hate to have those zeros not be too well matched, otherwise it'll end badly. So there's lots of risks in those dynamic parts of the mission. Other dynamic parts of the mission are any kind of maneuvers during the flight, any kind of docking, any kind of landing, anything that involves controlled release of energy. I'm not going to talk about any of that kind of stuff. That's what you all are experts in, not me. I'm going to talk about the stuff that happens during the benign, safe, comfortable, languorous parts of the mission, that is the parts of the flight that occur in between launches and landings. So the first one I want to talk about, the first crew hazard I want to talk about, is the one that everybody is going to be thinking about when we talk about risks of spaceflight, and that is radiation, the deep space radiation, or the radiation environment of the space flight. The radiation environment includes, as the chart shows, maybe you can see it down here at the bottom, galactic cosmic radiation. We've heard a discussion about that. That's the relativistic moving particles, ionized particles from the rest of the universe that seem contrarily to be aimed directly at our warm pink little bodies as we travel between the Earth and the Moon, or between the Earth and Mars. There's also solar energetic particles generated by cosmic coronal mass ejections, solar flares from the sun. Some of those particles get trapped in Earth's magnetic fields, forming the Van Allen belts. So that's a way for the radiation to stay just above our heads, but in close proximity to cause risks if you choose to transit those Van Allen belts and don't transit quickly and in the right direction. And my favorite, ultraviolet radiation. You can tell by the scarring on my forehead. I've had several interventions with a dermatologist because of interactions I've had with ultraviolet over the earliest years of my life. These are the radiation hazards of spaceflight. My colleague, Jim Logan, made a comment that I quote every time I give this chart, and that is, we shouldn't call it space, we should call it radiation, because that's what there is out there. I've not heard Jim say the rest of the quote, which is, we shouldn't call it Earth, we should call it water, because that's what it is down here, but you get the idea. Space is seething with radiation. Very little of it is good for us. NASA, the Human Research Program, has identified risks to guide its research. And in the area of radiation, NASA's Human Research Program has identified a risk, one risk, and you can read it right here, the risk of space radiation exposure on human health. That is the risk of all kinds of radiation causing all kinds of detriments to human health. The kinds of problems we might consider are cancer risk, and that is the driving risk in NASA's assessment of the effects of radiation on astronaut health, and it's abbreviated REID, R-E-I-D, the risk of exposure-induced death, which is a politically correct way of saying cancer. And the REID risk is the risk, it's the long pole in the tent, it's the risk that defines people's radiation status for scheduling for space flights. So astronauts, American astronauts and Western astronauts, flight status is determined in part by the calculation based on modeling of their likelihood of being a 2 or 3% increased relative risk of radiation exposure-induced death. For comparison, generally speaking, our risk of our risk of death by cancer is about 24%. Just generally speaking, that would be for people that are non-smokers and generally speaking good health. The risk of cancer death for people that are smokers is 27%. So that's a 3% difference in increased risk of cancer causing death during lifetime. The REID, the risk of exposure-induced death that NASA is adhering to, is for a 3% increase in the risk of a cancer death during the lifetime of the astronaut, not during the mission, but during the remainder of the lifetime of the astronaut, the 20 or 30 or 40 years after the Mars mission. So it's like going from being a non-smoker to a smoker. That level of risk is what drives NASA's radiation-based research. So just a little bit of context for you. And radiation, the other kinds, of course, are the problems of soft tissue damage. Think of cataracts, think of atherosclerosis, those kinds of things that can happen because of radiation exposure. And then also the least often mentioned, but perhaps the most important, is the effect of cognition, the effect of radiation on cognition. Having too many cosmic rays or solar energetic particles interfering at the part of the brain that tells the astronaut how to fly the Mars spaceship. So those are the risks of radiation exposure in Mars mission planning. And just for full disclosure, I wanted to give a little bit of a shout out to the concept of radiation shielding, radiation protection. You can do it in many different ways. You can induce a magnetic field around your spaceship if you've got an extra amount of electrical energy. You can shield your spaceship either with dedicated mass or with what's called parasitic shielding, that is putting the dense parts of your spaceship on the outside to form a bubble of security on the inside. You can have personal protective garments, and I am a consultant for a company that's building a personal protective garment that might be useful to protect the blood-forming organs and the radiation-sensitive tissues and the thorax of the astronaut during bad solar flares in flight. The company is called StimRad. The vest is called AstroRad, and it will be flown on one of 2 radiation-sensitive mannequins on Artemis 1, the first SLS mission, whenever it happens to fly on the first Orion vehicle. But there's other ways to shield, and other ways to minimize the effect of radiation, of course, are to go to avoid the Van Allen belts, to go north and south through the donut and go through them quickly, not lingering and not loitering in the radiation environment. After that, the next kind of risk, and there are 5 hazards I'm going to be categorizing the risks in. The next hazard is altered gravity fields. That's personally my favorite of the hazards. And I'm especially enamored with the idea of weightlessness. I think weightlessness is such a cool idea. I heard Jim one time on a zero-G airplane flight say being weightless is the most fun you can have with your clothes on. Jim, do you remember saying that? Yeah, he probably said it repeatedly. He never took his clothes off on the airplane, as far as I know, to validate that theory. But the altered gravity fields is what we're talking about when we're talking about differences in gravity environment. Right now, we are all at 1G Earth normal gravity. If you go to other destinations in the solar system, well, I mean, altered gravity does not include dancing on the ceiling, as occasionally happened in some MGM musicals of the 30s and the 40s. But it does involve astronauts being able to jump very, very high on the moon. This picture doesn't really do John Young justice, but it shows him considerably skyborne, if not airborne, at 1/6 of a G on the moon. And not surprisingly, the gravity level and the 3 planets that we are most likely to be associated with in the near future, Earth, Mars, and the moon, do vary based on their mass and their dimensions. Such that we have the possibility of 1/6 of G on the moon, 1/3 of a G on Mars, and 1 G on the Earth. I feel kind of self-conscious saying those numbers, but there may be somebody in the audience that hasn't quite figured that all out yet. My fellow panelist, Joe Carroll, has shown me a chart that proves or demonstrates that it's almost fortuitous that the 3 planets we're likely to have experience on have those G levels, because those G levels dominate the solid bodies we're likely to explore in the upcoming decades and centuries of human space exploration. 1/6 of a G over lots of small bodies, 1/3 of a G, Mars and Mercury, if anybody wants to weekend on Mercury, and then 1 G on Earth and Venus, and if we had some place to stand on Neptune and Saturn and Uranus, there might be 1 G there as well. So that's kind of it's almost like divinely inspired gravity levels for us to consider in our researches. And Joe Carroll's also given me a chart that does illustrate the fact that all of our discussion and speculation about effective G levels, if you decide you want to live on Mars or live on the moon or have artificial gravity in your spaceship, the effective G level is strictly a matter of your fantasy, because there is practically no data, no meaningful data on the value of any G level between 1 G or on the Earth and 0 G in space. And we have vastly more experience at 1 G and still many, many questions in space and human biology and human physiology after eons of experience at 1G, we have 500 plus people that have spent some time in 0G. So not surprisingly, there are still questions about the risks and benefits of 0G. And except for a few moments, a few heartbeats at 1/6 of a G on the moon, we have no 0.000 practical experience at those G levels. Anybody that wants to argue with me about that, I'm glad to do that. So our knowledge of the effects of gravity and the absence of gravity on the human body are summarized in the risks that the Human Research Program is addressing for exploration of Mars according to the design reference mission I described to you. And it includes the currently hot topic of intracranial hypertension and vision alterations. Also includes bone loss that may lead to renal stone formation, and neurological changes and muscle strength changes, and even host microorganism interactions. Everybody's least favorite, urinary retention, probably secondary to space motion sickness medication, and the one that I made my career on, orthostatic intolerance, that is lightheadedness during re-exposure to gravity. So there are a set of risks and also concerns relating to the absence or a change in gravity level in spaceflight environment. The next hazard I want to discuss is what's called the hostile closed environment. It really ought to be the hostile and closed environment, because outer space, as we already decided, is a hostile environment full of radiation and micrometeoroids and vacuum and temperature extremes, but we are surviving in our space habitat in a closed environment, which is to initial appearances benign, but may well become hostile later on if the things that you're filtering out accumulate and then leak into the environment. Needless to say, we have to worry about the environment that we're going to be living in. Idealistically and ideally, it'll look something like this, a lovely greenhouse on the surface of Mars, and you can contrast the lush greenness of the vegetation growing in the greenhouse with the barren redness of the planet itself. The risks that the Human Research Program is looking at in the context of a Mars exploration mission are the kinds of things that relate to the environment, and that can include the increased carbon dioxide inside of a spacecraft, and spacecraft will always have higher carbon dioxide than we do here on the ground. Even in a closed room like this, our carbon dioxide levels are much lower than they are on the space station. Food, nutrition, dynamic loads. We already discussed the dynamic environment of spaceflight, and that's part of the environment. Spacewalking, dust exposure, that is celestial dust, meaning planetary dust exposure on the moon and on Mars, and the things that relate to this, also including light and dark cycles, which can affect your circadian rhythms, and so forth. So there's a set of 12 risks that NASA is investigating, and each of these risks I'm showing you are being actively investigated. And by that I mean funded research is being done in these areas. The next one on the list of 5 hazards is isolation and confinement. And if that's not too hard to figure out, it's the psychological, psychosocial risk of spaceflight. And it is in 2 risks. The first is the one that talks about behavioral medicine, that is the cognitive or behavioral conditions, and psychiatric disorders to be expected or to be anticipated for spaceflight. And the next one is essentially how the team works together. So you've got 2 identified risks on the what's called the human factors and behavioral performance element of the Human Research Program, and one is what goes on inside of the astronaut's head, and this other one is what goes on between the astronauts. How do the teams adjust to the environment of space flight and the risks? The goal, of course, is to provide astronauts who do not sit morosely and forlornly on rocks on Mars, pining for the green fields of Earth, but they are instead able to function well in the very challenging, risky, and dynamic environment of spaceflight. And ideally also not to have bad days in space when they have arguments with each other, or more benignly, arguments with Earth. And I hope somebody recognizes this picture from my favorite science fiction movie ever, Marooned. It's alternately described as the best and the worst science fiction movie ever made, and I can see arguments in both cases. But this shows Gene Hackman as an astronaut who's shouting at mission control because he's just found out he's going to die in space. So it's a fairly normal reaction. But the risks and the work that's being done in this element for the Human Research Program is to understand is not to prevent bad days happening in space, because bad days will happen in space, but the work is being done to develop the treatments, the countermeasures, the selection criteria to minimize the effect of those bad days and to help the astronauts get back on an even keel so the team can then be productive for the very expensive and complex missions they've been assigned to. And the final hazard of the program is distance from Earth. It's a bit of a catch-all for things that didn't quite fit in other categories. And it does relate to, as everybody in this group knows, the fact that we have some substantial distance between the Earth and Mars, especially at the midpoint of a Mars mission, that does complicate such things as diagnosis of medical conditions in flight, especially pre-existing medical conditions that might not have been diagnosed, or medical conditions that were acquired because of the circumstances of spaceflight, and ineffective or toxic medications due to long-term stowage. That is, when those pills might have been within their deadline, within their lifetime when they were put aboard the spaceship, but if the spaceship was on a slow trajectory from Earth to Mars to be there as part of the infrastructure waiting for the astronauts to arrive, and then the astronauts take a long time to get there, and then the pills sit and sort of stew in the radiation environment of Mars, it's not surprising to expect that there will be occasionally ineffective or toxic meds or other things that have been included in the armamentarium of the astronauts for their time on Mars or another deep space locations. So the distance from Earth is just a bit of a catch-all. And let's see, I think I wanted to show you one aspect of the distance from Earth, just in case you hadn't realized it. This is a picture of sunset taken by the Curiosity rover, and that's Earth. That's Earth on a particularly good night of viewing, so it's an example of how far Earth is from Mars and how far help is from the astronauts on those distant locations. I think there's an overarching principle to all of this, though, and that is time. It's not one of the hazards of spaceflight, but time does make radiation worse. The more time you spend exposed to radiation, the worse it can be. The more time you spend in altered gravity fields, the more deleterious their effects might be. The more time you spend in your hostile environment or your closed environment, the more the effects can be. And we'll hear more about that in a second, I think. More time isolated and confined, and of course the distance from the Earth directly drives the time that is involved in the mission. Those are the hazards, those are the risks for NASA's planning for missions to Mars. I want to make that crystal clear. Those are the things that NASA is investigating in terms of sending astronauts to Mars and bringing them back safely to the Earth at the end of their mission. NASA does not have space settlement in its charter. I am not speaking for NASA, I'm retired from NASA, but I remember what we talked about, and I know NASA's charter does not include settling anybody on any place else except planet Earth. The goal, if you get on a NASA mission, is to come back to the Earth and have a long, happy, productive, and fruitful life afterwards. But what do we worry about when we're talking about space settling? And the things that this audience ought to be thinking about sort of fall into several big categories. Environmental influences, including but not limited to gravity and radiation and their effects on these things. And by gravity, I mean any gravity not equal to 1 G at 0 RPM. So if it's not 1 G, that's a difference in gravity that should be investigated. And I'm talking about static G, not rotational gravity, no head-to-foot gradients, nothing like that. This is where our data set exists right now, 1 G, 0 RPM, standing on the surface of the Earth. And yes, we can argue about how many RPM it really is. It's pretty close to 0 RPM. So developmental biology, you're going to hear some more about from Dr. Logan. But think about all of the aspects that may well be gravity dependent in human reproduction. The idea of populating other planets, other space settlements with fresh people is not without its challenges, including ethical challenges. If you're talking about burdening the next generation with effects due to the environment that have not been documented or understood yet, and they never had a chance to sign up for. Both before birth, and then how do you take care of the new crew member after birth? Then, assuming that NASA's hazard analysis covers that part of your active lifetime, think about rehabilitative medicine after injury or disease. How do you rehabilitate in your environment? How do you treat chronic diseases and morbidity, including what is a priority and what resources go into chronic diseases and morbidity? How much effort do you put into the one settler that is not doing well versus all the other settlers that really could use some additional attention to maintain the life of the settlement? Palliative care, when somebody's not ever going to get better, how much effort do you put into keeping them healthy, happy, comfortable, at the expense of what the rest of the settlement is doing? End-of-life care and considerations. When do you pull the plug? Do you pull the plug? Elon Musk has said he wants to die on Mars, not on impact, and he wants to die of old age. But think about, what does old age on Mars mean in terms of the economics of the settlement? And then once it's all said and done, what do you do with them? Do you recycle them like Soylent Green? Do you bury them? Do you cremate them? What are the planetary protection impacts of those kinds of problems? Which part of Mars do you contaminate with dead people? And what are the cultural sensitivities we need to worry about? Since this will probably be, your settlement will probably have different cultures making up the population. And as always, what resources do you put into doing that kind of, those kind of cares? So with that, I have reached the end of my presentation. Just some topics to discuss and to think about as we plan sending people beyond Earth into planetary exploration and then into planetary settlements and deep space settlements. And I look forward to your questions at the Q&A session. But right now, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Morgan Irons to talk to us a little bit about how to live on these environments and what the environmental aspects may well be. So, Dr. Irons.
I appreciate the doctor. I'm a doctor in training right now, currently a PhD student. Okay, wonderful. So, the first and only talk about agriculture. As was said, my background is in environmental science, biology, chemistry, and the like. And I have family members like my grandfather, as well as ancestry, who dealt in farming and the dairy industry and vegetable, potatoes, all of that. So this topic is pretty close to my heart. And it's interesting how sometimes we really forget as we look up at the stars to also look back at the ground and realize what we can learn here on Earth that can help us in space. And so my presentation will be talking about lessons of the past and how that can apply to the science of the future. So we've seen these pictures before, these beautiful paintings that have inspired a lot of science, as well as fiction, as well as imagination. And I look at these pictures, and this is something that I would eventually love to see. But I also have to ask the question of, is this ecologically possible? What really needs to go into developing these kinds of systems? Stepping away from the engineering components of it, is this ecologically possible? So to understand that, we have to go back and look at our history. So looking at the history of closed ecological system research for space habitation, starting all the way in 1895 with the publication of Dreams of Earth and Sky by Tchaikovsky, where he first depicts plants in space, this idea of having an ecological system in space. And this eventually led to scientists and medical doctors being inspired to take this a bit further in the Soviet Union with the BIOS experiments that they did starting in the 1960s. And with these experiments, they were looking at, could they really close off an ecological system and do so where they would have food production and resources that could support a group of people going into space. And then it wouldn't be until the 1970s, I believe, yes, in the 1970s, 1978 to be particular, NASA initiates their Controlled Ecological Life Support Systems program. And then other big things that happened, you also have Biosphere 2, which I assume many of you have heard about, which is currently owned by the University of Arizona. And from that experiment, we realized in a pretty spectacular way that there is a lot that we currently do not know about closing off ecological systems and even what's actually happening in an ecological system, even if it's not closed. What are these pathways? How are these different elements interacting? And as you can see, it's a pretty extensive history of closed ecological system research, with work being done in Japan, in China, in the US, and Canada, with this understanding of we're eventually going to get into space. How are we going to feed ourselves when we get there? And so from all of this research, we realized that there are problems that come with closing off ecological systems, such as the atmospheric fluctuations that happen when you have plants germinating and eventually maturing. What does that do to your oxygen content, your carbon dioxide, your volatile organic compounds, as well as what's happening inside the soil, what's happening with the nutrient cycling, what's happening with the carbon cycling, what's happening with the microorganisms. Are they flourishing, or are we having dangerous microorganisms that are doing better than the healthier microorganisms that would otherwise help with our plants? And so with all of these problems that we've seen across these experiments, pretty much we've concluded that it's hard to predict what disruptions will occur and the pathways that these reactions will take. But we've also had a lot of success with growing plants in space, especially through astrobiology studies done on the International Space Station, as well as other low Earth orbit stations. And so with this, we've seen that we're able to grow plants in space, but we've been really restricted by the actual space inside of our capsules. We can't really grow corn, we can't grow rice, we can't grow wheat, we can't grow these staples. We can grow a lot of pick and eat stuff. We can grow dwarf varieties. And all of these systems are supported through a hydroponic-like system, like the veggie system, which is currently up on the International Space Station. But even with these successes of, wow, we're able to grow these plants in space, we're still having some difficulties with that, which is one of the reasons why NASA has put out their solicitation research opportunities in space biology, with their current Appendix C requesting ideas for new nutrient delivery systems, new water delivery systems. How can we better utilize the actual growing space of the plants? And so with all of this knowledge, with all of these questions, sometimes we get so much in the nitty-gritty stuff we tend to forget what's our ultimate goal with developing an agricultural system in space? And that's the question of food security. So according to the United Nations FAO, food security is a situation that exists when all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. And based on this, we can pull out a couple of dimensions of food security. So with these dimensions, we have availability. Is this food present in your location? Is it present in production, or is it being shipped in? Do you have food reserves just in case a situation comes up where your agricultural system fails? Do you have a market for this? Is there an economic aspect to it? Do you have the transportation to get it to you? Or is there a locally growing wild food that you can pull from? Just like going out into a field and you know about a berry bush that's there, and you eat that just one summer day. That's an example of just having that local food there for you and having that availability. And then the access. Do you have sufficient access to this food on the household level as well as the individual level? And then utilization. Are you maximizing the consumption of adequate nutrition and energy? So what are your feeding practices? What are your dietary needs? Do you have different food cultures coming in to this environment? Or do you have somebody who has a food restriction where they can't, i.e. have wheat? I'm gluten-free, not by choice. I have this allergy, so I wouldn't be able to eat that kind of staple. And then stability. Are you having food security at all times? Or is your system constantly in flux, and sometimes you have food, sometimes you don't? So this is usually caused by climate changing, economy, social, and political factors. And so when we're talking about food security in space, some of us might think, well, this sounds impossible. Space is an extreme environment and completely isolated, and it would be really hard to have a supply chain out there. Well, when we look back at history and look back at traditional agricultural systems, we have good examples of people who have been able to survive in extreme environments, such as the Nabateans of Negev in the Middle East, where at their pinnacle moment in history, they were able to support 30,000 people in the middle of this desert that only receives 100 millimeters in the winter wet season for rain. And then they have springs here and there. So how were they able to do this? How were they able to survive in this desert and become this major trade route because of their agricultural system that they were able to have? Well, this goes into a very important ecological principle and idea. And this is called ecological services, which was introduced in the early 2000s by the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. And pretty much ecosystem services are talking about what benefits do humans get from our environment. And as I go through this, think about if you've received some of these services or how these services have played a part in your life. So first, we have provisioning services. Provisioning services are services extracted from nature that directly benefit humans. So we're talking about food, water, fuel, medicine, and the like. And moving on, we have regulating services. And these are ecosystem processes that moderate natural phenomenon and processes that work together to help with sustainability and resilience of the system. And these include pollination, decomposition in the soil, carbon storage, water purification that happens naturally. And then cultural services. This is something that people tend to forget as well. How do we interact with our environment culturally, psychologically? For many years, people have used their environment for religion and communicating with other tribes through cave drawings and spreading knowledge, and as well as recreation, of course, just having this healthy connection with our environment. And then the last ecological service is supporting services. And this is really the foundational processes that make all these other services possible, such as soil creation, biogeochemical cycles, nutrient cycling, biodiversity. And this is where a lot of my research is at as a PhD student, especially with the soil creation and soil revitalization. If we're not able to manage our soil and understand what's happening to allow us to have these services, then we get into a situation like the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, where you had this huge drought happening and mismanagement of the soil and unsustainable practices led to the topsoil just being stripped. And then we have what we see here, these huge dust storms, and it's taken decades for us to start to heal that. So when we're talking about potentially having a field-based agricultural system in space, what ecological services do we want in that system? Are we going to prioritize some over the other? Have we even considered these other ecological services that we haven't really thought of beyond, we need this for food? And then, of course, looking at soil as a potential medium for our agricultural system, 95% of the food produced around the world today is directly or indirectly produced using soil. So soil is such a huge resource that we depend on for our very livelihoods, even if we don't realize it. And so we really have to consider, when we go out into space, are we going to continue to use soil as a resource? And if not, how are we going to replace this resource to produce the amount of food that we're currently producing from it here on Earth? And so this also gets into the concept of ecological succession. If we are having an agricultural system on another planetary surface or even in free space, and we're going to be using soil or a mineral substrate for it, we have to understand how ecosystems are formed from scratch, which has happened here on Earth for hundreds of years. And it takes hundreds of years for an ecological system to form from that bare rock that you see going all the way to a climax community that we see outside here in Seattle. And so how can we take these processes, how can we take this ecological succession and expedite that? So that when we go to space, when we want to develop these agricultural systems, that we can get to the point where we can support people immediately. And so it seems pretty difficult. These don't really look highly fertile, and it seems impossible to turn something this degraded into something that you would see on Earth, like this. Well, an interesting fact is on your right side, the Mars regolith simulant, that's the before picture, that's the after picture of sustainable soil management on that substrate. So it's interesting what can happen when you're really looking at how can we manage our soils, and can we use these degraded substrates as a source, as a resource for agricultural systems. And I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip this. So I mentioned before that we could potentially have soil as a resource, but some of you might be thinking, what about hydroponic systems, aquaponic systems, aeroponic systems? They don't require soil for agricultural use, which is true. And just one moment. And what we've seen here on Earth with hydroponics, the ponics research, is that you can provide highly nutritious food from this. And we see hydroponics supporting restaurants, and we see people doing it in their backyards, and it seems like a really good idea, which I think it is. But you also have to think about the downside to these systems as well. This system is highly technical, so when you have wear and tear on this system, how are you going to replace those parts? Or will you have an industry on your location that can 3D print those parts so that you can keep your agricultural system running? But even if you have that industry side, how long is that going to take to replace that? And how long is your agricultural system going to be down, and can your plants survive that downtime? And then you have restrictions in plant diversity. You can't really grow highly caloric plants with this system as of current technology. So you're kind of restricted in the plant biodiversity that you can have. We've also seen microbial bloom difficulties with the nutrients in the water and then microorganisms carrying on the plant roots, which can lead to difficulties as well. And really, can this system alone be resilient enough to provide your sole agricultural system for your habitation? So what I'm thinking is, for an agricultural system in space, we need an integrated system, or what I would call an integrated field ponics agricultural system. In this case, what would benefit would be the time frame. As I said, agricultural systems, ecological systems can take years to form from scratch. So maybe you can have a hydroponic system at the very beginning to support your agricultural system as you're developing that field-based agricultural system as well. And this leads directly into risk management. If one system goes down, do you have another system that can help support you while the other one's being fixed? And then, of course, biodiversity. A field system can support so much more plant diversity than a hydroponic system, which allows you to have different kinds of plants to support food restrictions and nutritional needs, et cetera, et cetera. And then the integration of technology into such a system. Currently in the agricultural industry, we're seeing this movement towards digital agriculture, where we're creating technology that can do a lot of these time-consuming things for us, picking fruit off of plants, sensing whether it's time to harvest a plant or whether we should leave it on for a couple more days. And then efficiency. Are you using your space efficiently? So with a field system, of course, that's going to take up quite a bit of space. But with a hydroponic system integrated into this, you could use wall space, you can do hanging gardens, things like that, that can help you more efficiently use the space. And all of this goes into this need for stability, to always have food security at all times. This resiliency, if you have an unknown biovector come through and wipe out some of your crops, will your system survive? Isn't resilient enough to get out of that situation? And then sustainability, being able to have a system that is going to last you for the duration of your mission, or if it's for a lifetime, to last your lifetime. So understanding how we can sustainably manage the system so we don't repeat the same challenges and problems that we have here on Earth with our agricultural systems. And then adaptability, being able to give humans the adaptability that we have here on Earth, where if in agrarian societies, if they had a pest or a storm come through and wipe out their agricultural system, they were able to go into the wilderness around them and adapt and get the resources that they need to survive as they replace their agricultural system. So will we have that adaptability in our agricultural system to do that? And then independence, of course. Are we going to be heavily relying on a supply chain that's going to be economically and politically charged? Or will we have an agricultural system that allows us to be independent, that allows us to have plants that are multifunctional, plants that not only provide us food, but also can be used for medicinal purposes, or are nitrogen fixers that help with nitrogen cycling in the soil, and things like that. So this kind of goes into some of my research, where traditionally we've had closed ecological systems be the terminology, and with the research that I've been doing, where I've applied more ecological theories and principles, landscape theory, to these systems to help solve some of these problems that we've seen, I developed this phrase called a quasi-closed agroecological system, which is a system that uses the in-situ resources of the area where it is based and applies ecological theories, principles, and processes to maintain resilient agricultural production and ecological buffer systems with minimal loss and intake of resources. And so you may have never heard the word agroecology before. So where does that come from? So agroecology is pretty much applying ecological and social concepts and principles to the design and management of your agricultural system. And this also comes from the United Nations FAO, and pretty much it takes into account that biodiversity, that sharing of knowledge, getting people involved, understanding traditional knowledge and bringing it forward into modern contexts, and building that trust between people. Synergies, how can you use the system for multiple purposes? Aquaponics is kind of like that, where you have the system growing plants, but you also have fish and other aquatic animals living off of that system, so they synergize together. And then, of course, efficiency with reducing costs and that resiliency to get past and recover from disturbances. And these are just some pictures of the BIOS experiment, which is a closed ecological system that they developed, and then my company concept drawing of what a quasi-closed agroecological system may look like. And a lot of this is detailed in a patent that I have for such a system, and it's based on this 3-zone model that I developed while an undergraduate at Duke University. And it pretty much goes into all these challenges and then applies how we can solve these challenges with ecological principles and how we can solve this problem of ecological succession through expediting it, understanding competitive redundancy, as well as understanding the integration of these ecological services that I mentioned before. So I'm definitely over time right now. So is this really possible? Who knows? But there are definitely researchers working on revitalizing agricultural and ecological systems here on Earth that are being affected by climate change, desertification, and the like. But we don't really see them in the space industry right now because there's this idea that, oh, my system only applies to Earth. It's never going to be outside of Earth gravity, so doing space research is a waste of time. I've actually heard that from a lot of soil scientists and ecologists. So really, I'm hoping to expand this research a bit further because there really are these connections and challenges between what we're experiencing here on Earth and what we're going to experience in space. And so there's so much opportunity for collaboration. And then just remembering that we need, when we're thinking about these agricultural systems, that they supply us so much more than just food. So we need to understand all of the services that they provide to us and what we want to incorporate into our systems in space, whether we're going to prioritize some over another or we're going to replace some with technology, and what does that do for the system as a whole. And then, of course, we need to make sure that we do this sustainably. We do not want to repeat the same problems that we have here on Earth, and we don't want to be like the early colonists who pretty much just screwed over the traditional agricultural systems that were so sustainable and worked so well in those systems, and just had decades and years after that where our agricultural system just went down the tubes. But now with current research, we're getting back into those traditional sustainable practices and bringing them forward. And so how can we bring what we have here on Earth with our agricultural system and what we're learning to space? Thank you.
I'm Joe Carroll. I was on the construction panel yesterday, and one of the things I mentioned then that turns out to be relevant here is my talks, the titles generally now have question marks, okay? I used to think I knew a lot, but I think the most important things I can provide now are questions that the next generation is going to have to deal with, okay? And one of the questions is, will we be living beyond Earth in partial gravity? And two of my slides you've actually seen already. This is one. We really have lots of data on 1G. We have a fair amount of data on micro-G. But remember that micro-G, the first time we experienced it, it was just a few hours. Then about 6 years later, we had the two guys on Gemini for 14 days, which was longer than they needed for Apollo. And so, hey, we can do microgravity. No problem. That's when NASA stopped thinking about artificial gravity, okay? 2 weeks was fine. Well, 4, 6, 8 weeks on Skylab started to show problems. Longer experiences on MIR and ISS have shown a long list of, was it 9 or 10 or 12 issues, John, that you found listed on the sorts of experiences that are up to but not exceeding 1 year? How long do we have to experience moon gravity? We've had 1 to 3 days of up to 12 guys with 1 to 3 days of lunar gravity, but we didn't discover the microgravity problems until it was months. So very brief stays on the moon will not answer the questions, the question mark, and what is the uncertainty for G levels beyond 0 and 1. And actually, besides this, there's also the question of if you provide G level by spinning in an O'Neill cylinder, what is the acceptable gravity level? You don't want to assume that it has to be too small, because that says that the facility has to be much larger, and your first facility ends up being hundreds of billions of dollars more than it might need to be. So we need to know not just 0 and 1 to 1, that regime. We also need to know for sustained gravity provided by artificial gravity, what is the acceptable spin rate? Now, this is something I stumbled onto thanks to Gerald Nordley. If you do a research, I've got a bibliography on this, and Gerald Nordley's essay on quantized surface gravity is a delightful essay. He was the one that turned me onto the fact that in this solar system, gravity levels are quantized. They're clustered tightly in 3 levels. And unfortunately, the 4 gravity level planets near Earth are not the most practical places. 3 of them have escape velocities more than twice Earth. So if you go, you are only going one way, okay? Those 3 bodies also don't really have surfaces, so you're gonna have to be floating in balloons and stuff like that. And then Venus at least has slightly lower escape velocity than Earth, but it's really, really hot, and you don't want to go there soon, okay? Mars and Mercury have nearly the same gravity level, within 1%, and the 6 largest moons in the solar system have a fairly limited range of gravity levels, where our Earth's moon is pretty much near the middle, okay? So if you're interested in in finding out where you might want to have a settlement, there are only 2 gravity levels besides Earth that you really need to consider if you're going to live on a body. Okay, if you're going to be in an O'Neill cylinder, you can provide whatever level you want at whatever level you can afford to have a spin. So the question is, how can you test these 2 gravity levels on timescales that are relevant to find the problems that we have found in micro-G affordably and safely and reliably? And the idea here is an asymmetrical dumbbell. Now, I came up with the basic idea in the 1980s when I was studying ways to use shuttle external tanks in orbit. And an asymmetrical dumbbell would allow you to provide these 2 gravity levels. But it wasn't until the last few years that I started to realize the importance of this, that Mars and moon gravity, like the previous slide, are really the interesting gravity levels other than Earth gravity in this solar system. It's a really surprising thing. I would say that if you get anything from this talk, the things that I would like you to remember are the question mark about gravity levels between 0 and 1, and the clustering of gravity between Mars and at Mars and moon level. So you can spin a facility, you can have a module at the center of mass so you can do conventional docking. I think in the long run, it will end up being attractive to capture things at the bottom, trapeze-like capture, because you can do it from a lower eccentric orbit. It's a challenge, but with GPS and computers, it should be a tractable challenge. And it has the advantage of reducing your velocity to orbit by about 100 meters a second and your deorbit at the end by about 120 meters a second. And that's very useful. So the left-hand side shows the basic concept. The right-hand side shows what it might look like with solar arrays hanging from each facility. To make something like that, there are a couple key ingredients. One is the modules, okay? And I tend to think that long, thin modules oriented horizontally are attractive because they can allow you to walk in a long direction, get some ordinary exercise in the way that humans get their most exercise. If you use a cylinder that's the size, the diameter of the Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy tanks, the 12 feet, and you limit its length to the same that gives the same peak aero bending loads that you do with the normal fairing, it's about 21 meters, and 21 meters is about the length of a 737-600 cabin. Some of you will be going home on cabins like that. Just imagine that as the basic ingredient for these modules. The second ingredient is a tube the structure that ties things together. And this is an inflatable that actually two guys, when it's deflated, rolled up, and not holding a car, two people can carry, okay? This is Vectran and a polymer, I forget what polymer, rubbery polymer. You can do this with those materials, or you can use it with silicone as the matrix and astro quartz fibers to get something that's transparent so that you can actually grow food inside the tubes, okay? That's the second ingredient. The third is all the stuff you put inside. I was surprised to realize in the early days of discussions of the space station, Aaron Cohen told me the size of the tank doesn't matter, the shape. It's really all the stuff you put it inside that make the space station expensive. That's something you have to do here, but some of it may be easier to deal with because you don't have to deal with zero gravity. You have to deal with launch structure and launch vibrations, but once you get there, it's in gravity. And so there are a lot of things that may be able to work that are high reliability things that are cheaper on Earth that you can use there. And then one of the key questions, I could talk for half an hour on the subject of what spin rate is acceptable. And John Charles was the one that pointed out that to me that the ground-based rotating room tests are not necessarily relevant. When you're in one of those rooms, you have to tilt to one side. But that occurs the same wherever you are in the room and whichever way you're facing. That's because you're spinning this way. In a rotating gravity facility, you're this way and it's rotating like this. The effects that you have on your head change depending on whether you change from this way or this way. And if you walk this way, you get heavier, and you walk this way, you get lighter. Now, how big a deal is this? Most elevators, when they accelerate or decelerate, it's around 0.05 G. And usually when you're moving during that time, you stumble a bit. So that's an indication of, maybe you can get over it, but I'm not sure. So there is an uncertainty. You can answer some of it with tests that are very analogous to what were done, a test done on Gemini 11 and Gemini 12. And let me show you the video, or the mission movie. This was a 100-foot, essentially, seatbelt that was deployed between Gemini 11 and the Agena that they docked with, okay? And you could do the same thing with a Dragon 2 with its Falcon 9 second stage, but with a longer seatbelt and more spin. The interesting thing with this is that it was after the Gemini 7 mission that lasted 2 weeks. NASA had no interest in artificial gravity. They were interested in using this to stabilize spacecraft without docking them by having them tied together by some string, okay? And this went on for 3 hours. It was so boring after a while that the crew took a break to have lunch, okay? And at the end of the mission, they cut it after 3 hours, and they said that it was very slowly wrapping around the Agena and unwrapping, and they just found it really interesting. Okay? So that's the kind of test that you can do. Now, this is a very cautionary example that you may think is wacky, but I think it's relevant. The French did the Suez Canal in the 1850s, I think. Ferdinand de Lesseps was the manager. He wasn't an engineer, but he was a successful manager. The French had colonies in the Far East, and the Suez Canal was great for them because of that. When they tackled the Panama Canal 20 years later, I can't figure out why they did that other than the fact that they could, because the US was going to benefit way more than the French. It was actually a privately funded thing, and the key thing was that they did build and run a good hospital, but they didn't understand the centrality of the problem of mosquitoes, okay? And mosquitoes killed most of the 20,000 plus men that died in that effort, okay? Yellow fever and malaria. Now, is partial gravity the problem that will be analogous to malaria and yellow fever if the US doesn't take it seriously when some private group decides to colonize the moon or Mars? I think that we need to do tests in low Earth orbit with a spinning facility to find that out before we commit to something that puts many people on a body for many years. So my take on it, let me just ask you your conclusions. Would you prefer, if you were able to afford a trip to orbit, would you prefer to go to a facility that spins slowly enough that it's not obnoxious as a spin effect, to have access to Mars and moon gravity and free fall, or just a free fall only experience? Any preferences? Moon, Mars, and free fall, raise your hands. Okay, just free fall? Nobody? Okay. Oh, one person, okay. Should we do that before we do rotating colonies, O'Neill colonies? Question, should we do something like this before that? Yeah. Excuse me?
If you're going to go to Mars, I think you should do it beforehand because you don't want to be in zero G the whole year.
Yeah, yeah. Is Moon, Mars, and Leo the next step for manned space? Yes or no? Yes, raise hands. Okay. I'm 72 yesterday, okay? I can pitch this, but younger people are going to be making this if something like this happens. So I'm happy to collaborate with you and brainstorm with you, but contact me if you're interested in pursuing this. Okay? Remember, the gravity levels in this solar system, which is all we're going to be worried about for a while, okay, anybody, unless we believe in magic, are Earth, Moon, and Mars, and we know nothing about the long-term effects of Moon and Mars gravity until we do things like this. Okay?
Okay, I'm going to go through mine pretty fast because I feel like I'm preaching to the choir here, and I want to leave time for some questions. So let me queue up. Okay, if a Marty McFly-esque time traveler from the future magically materialized and pulled aside a then 18-year-old Jim Logan on July 20th, 1969, right after Armstrong made his first steps on the lunar surface and told me categorically that only 10 more astronauts would walk on the moon, all before January 1st, 1973, and thereafter, there would be absolutely no human presence on the moon or anywhere else in deep space for the next 50 years, I would have stared at him in utter disbelief and told him in no uncertain terms he was out of his friggin' mind. Much like Christopher Lloyd's Doc Brown reacted in 1955 to the news from the real Back to the Future Marty McFly that Ronald Reagan was president in 1985. Yet, that's exactly how it went down. No human being has been any further from the home planet than Silicon Valley is from Los Angeles in the past 47 years. Let's face it, O'Neill's vision was an extremely daring, radical, bold idea. It focused on space manufacturing and colonization. We forget that after a significant initial spike in public interest in his space colony concepts, which peaked in 1977 when he released his book, The High Frontier, O'Neill ran afoul of one of the most powerful men in the Senate, Republican William Proxmire of Wisconsin, who just happened to be chairman of the Senate committee that managed NASA's budget, who, after seeing a 60 Minutes program, CBS program 60 Minutes segments on space colonies aired in October of that year, responded publicly by saying, quote, direct quote, "It's the best argument yet for chopping NASA's funding to the bone. I say not a penny for this nutty fantasy," end quote. Proxmire made good on his threat by eliminating NASA funding support for space colonization research from the budget. NASA became almost paranoid about the public relations aspect and dropped O'Neill like a hot potato. After O'Neill's untimely death in 1992 at age 65, his vision seemed to atrophy and become, well, a little stale. Moon and Mars are all the rage now. You almost never see a reference to O'Neill, with the singular exception perhaps of Jeff Bezos. Elon Musk and his minions, from the people that I've talked to, actually view the O'Neill vision, if they're aware of it at all, with a certain disdain bordering on contempt. They've doubled down on Mars. Now, part of the reason for this is an odd confluence of two historical trends that, upon reflection, are actually related. The first is an internet, smartphone, social media-fueled phase change in media culture That finds them obsessed with clicks rather than credibility. More clicks means more eyeballs, which means more advertising, which means much greater revenue. Buzz is now the economic engine of media rather than accuracy or critical evaluation. There's very little true investigative journalism anymore, especially as it relates to space. Is Alan Boyle still here? Alan, are you present company accepted? Present company accepted. The media is now just a giant megaphone for marketing and branding. That's why we've seen a phenomenal increase in the latest breathless hype from Mars advocates like Musk. The newsmakers and the news distributors have independently discovered the more outlandish the claim, the wilder the prediction, the greater the audience, and therefore the revenue. It's a positive feedback loop with zero pushback. It's a true self-licking ice cream cone. The second is a general anti-expert, anti-science, and in many cases anti-establishment, extreme populist trend in space advocacy that I call the rise of the space cadet. Now, I'm not going to spend much time on this because there aren't many space cadets in this room because all you men and women are seasoned. Maybe we can come back to this in the question and answer session. But they're primarily motivated by ideology rather than evidence. They're drawn to magical thinking and have almost an irrational belief in truthiness, which is a concept defined by American humorist Stephen Colbert as the quality of seeming or being felt to be true, even if not necessarily true. During my years in mission control, I was taught the following mantra: in God we trust, all else bring numbers. So I've developed an actual mathematical definition of magical thinking. And here it is. Magical thinking equals ignorance to the power of arrogance. Ignorance to the power of arrogance. Think about it. Now I know what you're thinking. Why is this Logan guy being so hard on space cadets? Well, I used to be one. And like any other addiction, I am now and forever will be a recovering space cadet. Anybody recognize this? This is one of the famous publicity posters from the motion picture 2001: A Space Odyssey. Stanley Kubrick's mind-blowing, loving tribute to the next phase of evolution. And of course, made in widescreen, 70 millimeter, Super Panavision 3D emulating Cinerama. Now look at it. Isn't it beautiful? I couldn't get enough of this when I saw it. Everything about it called to me and resonated with me. I just knew in my heart and soul, this is the way it was going to be. I fell in love with the truthiness of it all. Now, here's the punchline. A full 50 years later, with the hindsight of a 40-year career in space medicine and direct mission support, I must unfortunately report to you there is nothing depicted in this vision that has withstood the test of time. Nothing. Everything about what it shows, what it depicts, what it implies, what it promises is no longer compatible with what we know about the space environment. So if you think the future in space looks like this, perhaps even this, and even this, I have bad news for you. It ain't gonna happen. Ain't gonna happen. And what about this? This is the ultimate magical thinking clickbait Mars propaganda. Everything about this slide is wrong. I could put on a whole seminar deconstructing all the wrongness included in this slide. It's a meme, and therefore it's just marketing. In essence, it's fantasy. This is reality. This is Gene Kranz and his famous flight control team at the end of the rescue of Apollo 13. You can see Jim Lovell's face on the TV monitor there, safely aboard the carrier Iwo Jima. Kranz and his flight control team had to deal with the initial hours of an unfolding catastrophe, which essentially became a race against time to keep the spacecraft and therefore the crew alive. Now here's the point. The Apollo 13 team, including the astronauts, had to deal with truth as it was, not how they wanted it to be. Think about that. For their roles, Kranz and the crew and the flight control team ultimately received the Medal of Freedom, Presidential Medal of Freedom. Now, I followed this with laser-like focus when I was a college student. I was so impressed with Kranz and his team, I decided that's something I wanted to do in my life. Almost 13 years later, to the day that this picture was taken, a young and invincible flight surgeon was invited to join the ranks of Kranz's mission control team. It's one of the most, it's really one of the most proudest accomplishments of my life. I learned a lot about reality and mission control during my 22 years at NASA. Reality one, space doesn't give a damn about your ideology. It's always trying to kill you. Reality two, humans are almost complete neophytes when it comes to experience in deep space or on other celestial bodies. So let's do the numbers. The cumulative human experience in space consists of about 540 people, 270 missions, racking up about 125 person years of total experience since 1961. Over 99% of that experience has been in low Earth orbit. Less than 0.8% has been in deep space, and only 0.5% on the lunar surface. Reality three, these are the big challenges to deep space settlement. Everything I'm going to say from now on has to do with space settlement, not with missions, okay? So John and I are of one mind about our beliefs about what needs and doesn't need to be done regarding missions and what needs and doesn't need to be done regarding deep space settlement. Bioastronautics is the tall pole in the tent. Now, I realize that's bad news to most of you. It's the reason I went into the space business, but when you start talking about greater than 6 months durations or interplanetary flight, ladies and gentlemen, that's the elephant in the room. And you better believe it. Second, flight dynamics. Mike, is he still here? I see him back there. Flight dynamicist tells you what you can do and what you can't do in space, and they aren't into magical thinking at all. Resources, including power. Power is a resource. Reality four, I hate to tell you this, but we are woefully unprepared, mostly by design, for deep space operations, and that goes double for anything resembling settlement. Now, O'Neill was certainly aware of the success of hard shell engineering, and that's the idea that you can surround an astronaut or a crew and create a kind of an Earth-like environment. You know, temperature, pressure, oxygen, those kind of things. And for short durations, that's really fine. But look at our experience on another celestial body. 6 Apollo missions logged about 600 surface hours on the lunar surface and 162 hours EVA. Since we had, it was actually 300 hours and 81 hours, but since there were 202 crew missions, it was 600 hours and 162 hours EVA. The average surface time per astronaut for EVA, for the Apollo astronaut on the moon was 2.08 days, and the average surface EVA time, a paltry 12.5 hours. That's it, people. That's it. That's the sum of human experience. Yet we talk glibly about going back to the moon, whatever that means, and instant cities on Mars of thousands of people transported by fleets of SpaceX starships by the mid-2030. We'll see. Sounds pretty optimistic to me. But let's examine what O'Neill got right, because a lot of the biggies he got right. He realized it was possible to build very large space habitats using extraterrestrial materials with foreseeable technologies. He understood, and this is still true, a planetary surface is not the place to locate an expanding technological civilization. Space colonies will be true settlements, not outposts, and will consist of men, women, children, and multiple generation. Colonies, and this is a biggie, in the absence of decades of scientific research, will have to recreate and sustain with as much fidelity as possible Earth-like environments to optimize success for the earliest space colonies. And he also inspired a whole new generation of space advocates. Now, he got these things right in large part because he was a physicist. Now, let's examine the flip side. Because he was a physicist, he got some things wrong. He didn't comprehend the political complexities of funding such a daring idea. He vastly overestimated the capabilities and the economic efficiencies of the space shuttle. The launch costs for the space shuttle in 1977 were estimated to be 10 million. By 1981, 38 million. By 1985, they were subsidized for commercial partners to 180 million, and by the end of the project, it was 1.1 million. If you included the development costs, it was 1.1 billion for 2011, and if you included the development costs, it was 1.7 billion with a B dollars a launch. He vastly underestimated that. He vastly underestimated the shielding mass required for radiation protection. Now, I've got a slide later on that I'll show that goes into that. He also, as much as I love satellite solar power, John, it's a great idea. I still believe in it. I love it. I think it'll happen. O'Neill made the mistake of linking colony prosperity to space solar power. And his timing in doing that was terrible when you look at the history. Overall, the entire O'Neill vision was way too complex, required an installation of a massive infrastructure prior to any economic ROI. And he did not appreciate that bioastronautics would be the tall pole in the tent when it came to settlement. So, can a reboot from the vantage point of 2019 breathe new life into the O'Neill Space Colony concept? And if the goal is to establish the very first self-sustaining and potentially self-replicating human colony in space, what would be the essential settlement criteria to maximize the chances of success? And remember, I have to keep reminding you, we're still talking about settlement. Of the numerous criteria that are important, there are 7 that I've come to believe over a 38-year career in space medicine are essential. And I've dubbed these particular 7 the Logan criteria only to delineate them from those who will undoubtedly be suggested by others. So I'm not saying this is right, I'm saying these are mine. And so I'm going to call them the Logan criteria to differentiate them from the Carroll criteria or whatever. So let's go over this. And I know I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, but this is going to be, I think, pretty illuminating as we go through. So here are the Logan Essentials 7. Low delta V. That's the change in velocity. That's the oomph, if you will, usually in terms of kilometers per second, that it takes to get from point A to point B in the solar system. Delta V multiplied by time is the best metric of what we would functionally call distance in human spaceflight. This has to do with accessibility. Delta V is measured round trip, out and back to low Earth orbit. It costs you coming and going, and the mass of the vehicle determines, and the amount of propellant, the mass of the vehicle determines the amount of propellant provided. And remember, it takes propellant to transport propellant. So delta V is the coin of the realm in space. Next, lots of resources, and the resources should be local. When Europeans first came to the New World, they didn't have to bring every brick, every board, every nail, every morsel of food that they ate, and every molecule of air that they breathed. Had that been the case, ladies and gentlemen, it would have never happened. What they did was they brought themselves, they brought their tools, and they brought their knowledge. And they learned how to live off the land and to fashion almost everything they needed from local environments. So the resources need to be there, not thousands of miles away at the bottom of a gravity well. Speaking of gravity wells, the third one is a little or no gravity well. Gravity or lack of it is responsible for 3 of the 7 essential criteria. Also related to delta V, gravity wells are a little different. And we all know this. This is the Apollo 5 moonship. This particular one happens to be Apollo 17, and it was 6.5 million pounds fully fueled on the pad. 8 minutes later, expending propellant and dropping stages, feeding the gravity beast, if you will, it has lost over 95% of its mass. 95%. The next one, at or near normal gravity for people, plants, and animals. Now this is a caveat, because at first this seems mutually exclusive with little or no gravity wells. How can there be a viable place that satisfies both criteria? Well, hold that thought. We'll get to that shortly. All life on Earth arose, evolved, and persisted over the last 3 billion years, and it did so under the constant influence of gravity. Over geologic time, there were huge changes. The atmosphere changed, oxygen concentration changed, the oceans changed, the climate whipsawed back and forth between tropical Earth and snowball Earth. Even the continents changed and took up new positions. Vast mountain ranges were thrown up by collisions with the tectonic plates and then dissolved into the sea over time. But only one thing never changed: gravity. Gravity never changed. So gravity is the law. Evolution has superbly crafted us to be gravity-dependent creatures. This is especially true with reproduction. I personally think, as a former evolutionary biologist, it is exceedingly naive to think that after billions of years where we have been literally perfected to one Earth gravity, to think we're going to take one giant leap into a weightless civilization. It may happen, but I don't think so. There has to be natural 24/7 passive radiation protection. And by passive, I mean protection that requires no power and no delta V. As John said when he quoted me, space is misnamed. Okay, it implies a world that is kind of a benign nothingness. And in reality, space is a seething, undulating cauldron of highly dangerous radiation coming from all directions, spiked occasionally by short-term potential lethal blasts of radiation from our own sun. I'm not going to go, because of time and because this is a sophisticated audience, I'm not going to go into this in any major detail. I just want to point out that in interplanetary space, and ladies and gentlemen, these aren't my numbers, these are the numbers. The flux in interplanetary space is 200 times the daily dose at sea level and 2,000 times the GCR dose at sea level on Earth. For you radiation deniers, and I know you're out there, that's the equivalent of a whole body CT scan every 5 to 6 days for the entire duration of the mission. On the ISS and the Martian surface, the dose is about 75 times the Earth daily dose and only 744 times the GCR dose. beyond the magnetosphere, the maximal daily dose limit for a human embryo or fetus is exceeded every 13 minutes in deep space and every 34 minutes on Mars. That should be a sobering statistic for you. This is a radiation protection scale. Because of time, I'm not going to go into that. What it shows is that on Earth, we're protected by the equivalent of 132 grams per square centimeter radiation equivalent, 24/7 passive. So if men and women ever live on the surface or on the moon or Mars, they'll have to live like ants, earthworms, or moles. So all those pretty cities you see in the PowerPoint presentations ain't going to happen. When I ran this by an ex-Apollo astronaut, he said, so what you're telling me is you have to dig a hole, huh? Well, good luck with that. That was his tone. I looked at him and I said, look, any advanced technological civilization that can travel 560 million kilometers from one planet to another and either can't or won't dig a hole doesn't deserve to be there in the first place. He didn't have a comment to that. All right, radiation shielding. Radiation shielding, this is an idea of using water for shielding. So here's the metric that you probably ought to learn. If you want to protect your colony to 1/2 the level that we're protected on Earth, that would take a sphere of water 5 meters all the way around your habitat. If you want to protect it to full Earth protection, what I call RP 100, radiation protection 100%, that's 10 meters around your entire habitat, the equivalent of water. So here's how O'Neill underestimated that. The first estimate is the O'Neill estimate. I've got the reference here from the 3rd edition, page 59 in 2000. His estimate was 2.7 million metric tons for radiation protection. That made the radiation protection 88% of the total mass. The second one is the Logan estimate using water as a radiation protection shell, and that's 4.1 million metric tons. That's 92% of the mass, and that's at only 50% protection. At 100% protection, RP 100, it's 8.5 million metric tons, which makes it 95% the total mass of the habitat. Now, clearly, this really isn't feasible, right? And this is going to be very important when we talk about where we want to put these kinds of colonies. So here's how to think about radiation. When modern Homo sapiens first left Africa, they were faced with water. That was in the Pleistocene, and in the Pleistocene, because of all the ice, sea level was 300 feet lower. So when they moved here to the Horn there, what's now called the Gate of Grief, they could see, modern humans could see a series of islands, and they could also see the horizon on the other side. Now, they learned real quick that water, especially salt water, could kill them. I don't think it took them very long to understand that concept. If they drank it, it would kill them. If they tried to swim in it to the first island and drowned, it would kill them, or it could make them hypothermic and kill them. So what did they have to do? They obviously were successful getting out of Africa. They had to develop the technology to isolate themselves from the hazard. What do we call that technology? Boats. So there's nothing new under the sun. We're not doing anything different. It's just the frontier is different. And our ocean is the radiation ocean. So we're going to have to figure out the technology to isolate ourselves from the hazard, or we're not going anywhere. So anytime you think about radiation, use this analogy to help you think through it. It's got to permit large, redundant ecosystems that are fault tolerant, and it needs to be a staging area for exploration and expansion, including, this is critical, frequent, scheduled, recurrent launch windows, okay? So here's a quote that I came across recently that kind of summed up my attitude about it. We need to stop this obsessive preoccupation with large spherical bodies at the bottom of significant gravity wells with essentially no atmosphere and no magnetic field. These places just aren't good for us, at least not for settlement, frontier, or civilization destinations. And then it dawned on me why I thought it was such a good quote. It was my quote. Okay, so here is the settlement criteria. So we need at or near normal gravity for people, plants, and animals, and little or no gravity well. You can only do that with artificial gravity. So what we have to figure out, and Joe alluded to this earlier, is what is the gravity prescription? What's the dose, what's the frequency, and what's the side effects? So here we are. So as we review this, the moon and Mars really they don't come across very well using these criteria. And remember, these criteria for maximizing the success of human settlement. But there are two places in the inner solar system you could do this that would fulfill every single criteria. Phobos and Deimos. It would fulfill every single one. Deimos is the better one, and I'll go into why that is. Deimos is locked. It always has the same side facing Mars. And these are the virtues of Deimos. Before I go back there, the Mars-facing side of Deimos is probably the most valuable real estate in the inner solar system, in my opinion. The virtues of Deimos, well, escape velocity is 12.5 miles an hour. Mike, you'll probably like that, right? He's giving me a thumbs up. Only 20,000 kilometers from the Martian surface. There's a launch window every 2.14 years, and you can visualize all of Mars except for the extreme polar regions. Mars round-trip light time, 0.13 seconds. And it could be a carbonaceous chondrite. May not be, but it could be, in which case it might have water. So this is a schematic. This is a real picture of the Earth and the Moon. Yeah, this is not a schematic. I'll do it in 3, okay? And this is what this is how close Phobos and Deimos is to Mars, if you use the Earth and the Moon as a scale. So here's Deimos. What you would do is you would core out a part of Deimos, and we read articles all the time about boring companies and tunneling and the big dig and all that kind of stuff. So here's what you do. You do a core size about a half a kilometer by 15 kilometers. It's a volume of 2.5 cubic kilometers. There's a mean density and a core mass. If that core was 1% water, which it could be, that's 36.7 billion liters, 3%, 110, and 5%, 183 billion liters, if you process that. So let's go back to the O'Neill colony, chop off all the mirrors and all that kind of thing. You don't need that where we're going. So here it is. So what would you do? You would do your core, and inside that core, and this is drawn to scale, you could put 11 Island 1 O'Neill colonies in the core of Deimos. Even better, let's just do 10 and put an airlock on either end, an inflatable airlock that now becomes a shirt sleeve, pressurized, radiation protected dry dock for large spacecraft and satellites heading to the outer solar system. Ladies and gentlemen, that in itself justifies colonies at Deimos. So Deimos could end up being the Manhattan of the outer solar system. So just to finish up, here are some views that we've all seen. Again, I know I'm preaching to the choir, so I won't do this. So the art of bioneering is turning this into this. Thank you very much. Edward, I know we've run really late, so what do you want us to do?
I think we have time for maybe 2
Panel, come on up.
And we've got a half-hour break, right? Those who want to come.
Yeah, if anybody wants to come and talk to us, because I don't want to infringe on anybody's break. It's been a long day.
Yeah.
And I'll take advantage of my privilege as the chairman to ask the first question. I was on a panel with Brother Guy Kranz, Council Manuel, I believe his name is, the Vatican astronomer, a few years ago. And one of the things that he stated was that every single asteroid above a minimal trivial size is actually a rubble pile rather than a solid object. I suppose we probably don't know anything about Phobos and Deimos at that level, but would that actually be a complicating factor?
But yes, it would be a complicating factor, and we need ground truth data for Deimos. Nobody's done that. The image that I showed was the best image available for Deimos. That was a real image. And so we need samples from Deimos. We need core samples. A lot of scientists think that Phobos is probably 25% empty space, subterranean empty space. We don't know that about Deimos, but that's possible. So it might be as easy as popping through the surface and just pushing everything out of the way. And please understand, I'm not advocating that we go up and build 13 space colonies. What I'm saying is we build up to that. Maybe use one of Al's colonies to start off. You perfect it in low Earth orbit, figure out how to build it, and then we go to Deimos, we do our core, we figure out what's in there, we use that material to process to build one of your smaller colonies, and then build up to the O'Neill colonies. Did I interrupt your question?
No, I'm ready. So you ready for that question? Okay. So this is a...
Make sure the mic's on, I don't think it's turned off.
It's turned off? Test.
Why don't you grab this one out?
This is in regards to a discussion that John Menkins and I have had. Have people ever lived on an almost entirely hydroponic diet for any significant length of time? And if so, were there any health effects detected?
So there isn't anything currently published. I don't know what some people do in their personal time. But there's currently no research published on it, which would definitely be interesting. Currently what we know is that with hydroponics, aquaponics, and aeroponics, a lot of these are supplementary, where like you can use them for a restaurant or you can use them to produce these high-valued green crops. But there really hasn't been a lot of feasibility when it comes to can we use hydroponics to really support root crops like potatoes or anything high caloric in value. There hasn't really been success with that, which is why I think like you can use these ponics systems to produce these highly nutritious, high nutrient value crops that require like particular temperatures and humidity to really do well, while you have a farm system that can really help give you that calorie content that you need. And I mean, we see these in, just think of it this way. If you're in a refugee camp, or if you're in an isolated community in like the Horn of Africa, is it more helpful for them to have a hydroponic system? Is that even feasible? Or would it be more feasible to actually have a field-based gardening system, economically, energy-wise, with the resources that they have? Because that's pretty much what we're going to be having in space, is you're in this really isolated, far from home situation, and you have to use what you have. And are there resources that can be better allocated for other things, i.e. energy to run your hydroponic system, or having a field-based system that doesn't require that same amount of energy to produce that food in that way.
But what I really want to know about is grapes, barley, and hops. Because I'm not going anywhere that doesn't have those three things.
That's true. That's true.
Coffee.
Yeah, I always ask people, what plant would you bring that you can't live without? And coffee tends to be the number one answer.
Yeah, I think Biosphere 2 had enough coffee to provide a cup of coffee for each person every other week. They didn't plan it very well.
That's cruel.
And then, as I understand it, the first year, the ants that were imported into the tree root bowls out-ate the colonists, the bionuts. That's why they lost weight.
So since Al mentioned the conversation that he and I had been having, I wanted to focus in for just a second also on hydroponics, but what I would personally really like to see, if such a thing exists, is something from the literature that shows in detail the mass and energy flows for one of these big hydroponic towers. Because the argument that I made with Al during yesterday's conversation was that the reason why these things are cost-effective, why they're profitable, is because they depend on the enormity of the ecosystem outside their walls. For the nutrients that come in, and the effluents that go out, and the energy flows, and thermal management, and that none of that stuff is going to work without the rest of Europe and so on. And so, but if you've got a reference, I would love to see it. A good analysis of the energy and mass flows for one of these hydroponic machines.
Yeah, nothing's coming to mind.
Yeah,
at
I can't
present.
find one. I'm looking, and I
Yeah.
can't find anybody who's treated it with rigor. Oh.
And by the way, I'm so pleased that we had a presentation in the Bioneering Panel on space agriculture. Isn't everybody glad that we did that?
I'd like to comment that I was surprised to realize that, Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, Utah State, Texas A&M, they're all Aggie schools. And I mentioned this to Jordi Pugswari, and he said, well, usually those schools also have good mechanical engineering departments. Well, I found out later that the Morrill Act that created the land-grant college system, that created all the Aggie schools, required that you teach agriculture and the mechanical arts. So any of you that are connected to any Aggie school that's got any interest in space, go over to the Aggie people and talk with them. Okay?
Yeah, there's a lot of area for collaboration that's just not happening. And then especially on the agricultural, soil science, not really biology. We have pretty good astrobiology going on, but really with the deep, agricultural field system side of things, there's just this disconnect, and the scientists over there just don't really see their time being valuable in the space industry. And why do I need to study soils outside of Earth's gravity when they're always going to be in Earth's gravity?
Yeah, one of your charts showed 0.016 millisieverts a day is the human dose for fetus.
Yeah, I don't know what the number was, but there was a number on the
if
chart.
you go to hotflights.com, people get that per hour at 41,000 feet. So
Well, there may be a typo on my slide, so I'll have to check that.
Okay, yeah, so that just kind of...
But I can tell you that I did double and triple check the fact that you get the daily amount, the maximal daily amount of radiation for a fetus every 13 minutes in deep space, and every 35 minutes on the Martian surface.
Well, hotflights.com has some interesting numbers for you.
Okay. It's time for our break. We have some more snacks upstairs if anyone wants to get some more nourishment. And then we'll be back here in about 30 minutes for our next panel. And if anyone else has questions, you're welcome to have at our guests.